The factory whistle screamed before sunrise, and across America, lights flickered on in places that had once made refrigerators, typewriters, cars, sewing machines, and farm tools. In Detroit, men with tired eyes stepped into plants that no longer built family sedans, but engines for bombers. In California shipyards, welders climbed into the ribs of half-born vessels while sparks fell like orange rain. In Kansas, young women in bandanas learned to drive rivets into the silver skin of aircraft that would cross oceans. In New York, mothers kissed sons goodbye at train stations and tried not to cry until the smoke swallowed the caboose. And somewhere far away, in the darkness over Europe and the vast silence of the Pacific, the question was no longer whether the United States could stay out of the war. The question was whether America could help end it. The answer did not come all at once. It came in steel, in ships, in wheat, in blood. It came in the low rumble of Liberty ships crossing submarine-haunted waters. It came in the roar of B-17s climbing into freezing skies over Germany. It came in the boots of American infantrymen stepping off landing craft into surf already stained red. It came in the hands of nurses working under canvas tents, in black soldiers driving trucks through mud and discrimination, in Native American code talkers carrying messages the enemy could not break, in farmers producing more food than anyone thought possible, in children collecting scrap metal from alleys and schoolyards. It came from a nation that had spent years trying to avoid the fire, only to become one of the great engines that extinguished it. The Soviet Union absorbed and inflicted catastrophic losses on Nazi Germany in the East. Britain stood against Hitler when much of Europe had fallen. China had been fighting Japan for years before Pearl Harbor. Commonwealth forces, Free French troops, resistance fighters, Poles, Dutch, Greeks, Filipinos, Yugoslav partisans, and countless others carried burdens that history can never reduce to a footnote. Allied victory was not a solo performance. It was a brutal coalition achievement. Yet within that coalition, the American role became something immense and decisive. Not only battlefield power, but industrial power, financial power, naval power, air power, logistical power, and the political will to sustain war on a scale almost beyond imagination. Before the first American soldier stormed a beach in Europe, American aid was already moving across the Atlantic. Franklin Roosevelt understood what many isolationists resisted. If Britain fell, the United States would face a darker and more dangerous world. In March 1941, the Lend-Lease program allowed the United States to supply Allied nations with war material even before America formally entered the conflict. Over the course of the war, Washington made Lend-Lease agreements with more than 30 countries and provided about $50 billion in assistance, a staggering sum for its time. The aid went to Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and many others, not as charity alone, but as strategy: keep the enemies of the Axis fighting, keep the fronts alive, and buy time for America to prepare. In Britain, that help arrived in the form of aircraft, trucks, ships, food, fuel, and raw materials. In the Soviet Union, it arrived as Studebaker trucks, locomotives, rails, boots, canned meat, aluminum, communications equipment, and other supplies that helped move armies across a continent of snow, fire, and ruin. The Red Army did most of the killing and dying against Nazi Germany on the Eastern Front, and no honest history should obscure that. But logistics decide wars as surely as courage does. A tank without fuel is a statue. An army without trucks moves at the speed of exhausted men and horses. American material did not replace Soviet sacrifice. It amplified Soviet endurance. Then came the morning that changed everything. Pearl Harbor lay quiet under a bright Hawaiian sky. Sailors were eating breakfast. Some were still asleep. Church bells would have rung soon. Then the sound came low over the water, engines growing louder until the sky itself seemed to tear open. Japanese aircraft from 6 carriers struck Pearl Harbor in 2 waves, attacking battleships, airfields, and the heart of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. The battleships burning along Battleship Row became images that would live in American memory forever. Black smoke rising, oil burning on the harbor, men trapped below decks, sailors diving into flaming water. The United States had tried to stand apart from the war. In a single morning, war came crashing through the door. The attack was devastating, but it failed to destroy the one force that would reshape the Pacific, the American carrier fleet. The battleship age had already begun to fade, though many did not yet fully understand it. In the Pacific, aircraft carriers would become the dominant combat vessels, central to battles like Coral Sea, Midway, and Leyte Gulf. The United States would learn this lesson in blood, then master it with terrifying speed. The first months were dark. The Philippines fell after a desperate defense. American and Filipino prisoners endured the horrors of the Bataan Death March. Guam and Wake were taken. Japanese forces seemed unstoppable, pushing across the Pacific with speed and confidence. In Washington, commanders stared at maps filled with red arrows. In living rooms across America, families listened to radio reports and wondered where their sons might be sent. Victory did not feel inevitable. It felt distant, uncertain, almost unreachable. And then, slowly, the machine began to move. The American contribution to victory was not only that its soldiers fought. It was that the country became a continental-scale war engine. The numbers still feel unreal. American industry produced nearly two-thirds of Allied military equipment during the war, including hundreds of thousands of aircraft, artillery pieces, tanks, and trucks. PBS summarizes the scale at roughly 297,000 aircraft, 193,000 artillery pieces, 86,000 tanks, and about 2 million Army trucks. These were not just statistics. They were the bones and muscles of Allied mobility. They were the reason armies could cross deserts, break out of beachheads, chase retreating enemies, and keep fighting after losses that would have shattered smaller economies. Automobile plants stopped producing civilian cars and turned toward war. One Defense Department account notes that about 3 million automobiles were made in the United States in 1941, but during the war only 139 additional cars came off assembly lines as automakers shifted to guns, trucks, tanks, and aircraft engines. That detail captures the magnitude of the conversion better than any slogan. America did not merely add war production to civilian life. It rearranged civilian life around war. The home front became a battlefield of another kind. Housewives saved bacon grease for explosives. Children collected scrap metal. Victory gardens grew in backyards and vacant lots. Families bought war bonds not only because posters told them to, but because their sons were somewhere overseas and money felt like one of the few things they could send after them. Ration books shaped dinner tables. Gasoline, sugar, coffee, meat, rubber, everything had a shadow cast over it by the war. For many Americans, sacrifice was not dramatic. It was daily. It was standing in line. It was doing without. It was waiting for a telegram that no family wanted to receive. And the telegrams came. More than 16 million Americans served in uniform during World War II. Over 407,000 U.S. service members died, and more than 671,000 were wounded. Behind each number was a bedroom left untouched, a mother listening for footsteps that would never return, a wife folding a letter until the creases softened, a child growing up with a photograph instead of a father. The scale of American sacrifice was smaller than the terrible losses suffered by the Soviet Union, China, Germany, Japan, Poland, and others. But for American families, loss was never comparative. It was absolute. The American soldier who entered the war was not a mythic figure. He was often young, nervous, undertrained at first, and far from home. He came from Iowa farms, Brooklyn apartments, Texas oil towns, Alabama mills, California neighborhoods, reservations, immigrant families, segregated communities, and college campuses. He carried photographs in his pocket. He joked when he was afraid. He cursed the mud, the officers, the food, and the weather. He wrote letters that made the war sound easier than it was because he did not want to worry anyone back home. Then he was asked to cross oceans and do things no ordinary person should ever have to do. In North Africa, American forces learned hard lessons. They met German veterans who had already conquered much of Europe. At Kasserine Pass in 1943, U.S. troops suffered a painful defeat against experienced Axis forces. Men ran. Command failed. Equipment was lost. It was humiliating, but it was not the end. The Americans learned. They reorganized. Leadership improved. Training sharpened. Coordination between infantry, armor, artillery, and air power grew stronger. The U.S. Army that stumbled in Tunisia was not the same army that would fight across France. That transformation was one of America's greatest wartime achievements, the ability to absorb failure, adapt, and return stronger. In the skies over Europe, American air crews entered another kind of war. The 8th Air Force flew daylight bombing missions against German industrial and military targets. The theory was precision. The reality was ice on the inside of aircraft, oxygen masks freezing, flak bursting like black flowers around the formations, and German fighters cutting through bomber streams. Men flew at altitudes where exposed skin could freeze. AB-17 might return with holes through its wings, an engine dead, blood on the floor, and a crew counting the empty spaces in the formation where friends had been minutes before. The bombing campaign remains debated by historians, especially because of civilian casualties and the moral questions of strategic bombing. But militarily, it forced Germany to divert aircraft, guns, pilots, labor, and fuel into air defense, while Allied air power gradually weakened the Luftwaffe before the invasion of Western Europe. That invasion required something more than courage. It required logistics on a scale that bordered on the impossible. The Allies had to move men, tanks, trucks, fuel, ammunition, medical supplies, radios, bulldozers, landing craft, and food across the English Channel into the teeth of German defenses. Britain served as the great staging ground. Canadian troops would storm Juno Beach. British forces would land at Gold and Sword. Americans would land at Utah and Omaha. Behind them were planners, sailors, meteorologists, engineers, intelligence officers, resistance networks, and factory workers who would never appear in the famous photographs but without whom the invasion could not happen. At Omaha Beach, the sea was rough, the air filled with smoke, and the landing craft doors dropped into chaos. Many men never made it across the sand. The beach was swept by machine gun fire, artillery, mortars, and fear. Officers died. Radios failed. Units became mixed. Men hid behind obstacles and bodies because there was nowhere else to hide. The plan broke apart in the surf. Yet small groups began to move. A sergeant here. A lieutenant there. Engineers blew gaps. Infantry crawled forward. Destroyers moved dangerously close to shore to fire on German positions. Paris was liberated, but the war did not end. Germany still fought with discipline and desperation. In the Hurtgen Forest, American troops entered a nightmare of trees, mines, mud, artillery bursts, and cold rain. The forest swallowed sound and men. Progress was measured in yards. The battle remains one of the most controversial and costly American campaigns in Europe, a place where strategic purpose and human cost are still debated. It reminds us that victory was not a clean upward line. It was often confused, wasteful, and agonizing. Then, in December 1944, Hitler struck through the Ardennes. Snow covered the forests. Fog grounded Allied aircraft. German armor pushed into American lines, creating what became known as the Battle of the Bulge. Exhausted American troops, some inexperienced, some battered from earlier fighting, suddenly faced one of Germany's last major offensives. At Bastogne, surrounded Americans held out in freezing conditions. Men slept in foxholes cut into frozen earth. Medics worked until their hands numbed. Ammunition ran low. The cold became an enemy with no uniform. When the weather cleared, Allied air power returned, and the German offensive began to fail. The battle cost dearly, but it broke Germany's remaining offensive strength in the West. Across the world, the Pacific War had its own terrible rhythm. It was a war of distance, heat, jungle, coral, disease, and island fortresses. American strategy did not require capturing every Japanese-held island. Instead, commanders advanced across the Pacific by taking key positions and bypassing others, cutting them off. But every landing still carried the possibility of nightmare. Tarawa showed how costly a small island could be. Peleliu became a furnace of coral ridges and caves. Saipan brought. The American contribution in the Pacific was built on sea power. After Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy and American shipyards rebuilt and expanded at astonishing speed. Aircraft carriers, submarines, destroyers, amphibious ships, landing craft, tankers, repair ships, the Pacific War required not only fighting ships, but a floating industrial system. The United States had to project power across thousands of miles of ocean, sustain fleets at sea, and move entire armies from island to island. At Midway, American codebreakers, pilots, sailors, and commanders helped turn the tide by sinking 4 Japanese carriers. It was not the end of Japan's naval power, but it changed the strategic balance. From that point forward, Japan increasingly fought a defensive war against an enemy whose industrial depth it could not match. American submarines carried out one of the most devastating campaigns of the Pacific, strangling Japanese shipping and cutting the arteries of empire. The work was dangerous and often invisible. Submariners lived in steel tubes beneath hostile waters, listening for propellers and depth charges, sweating in stale air, knowing that a single mistake could turn the ocean into their grave. Their campaign helped isolate Japan from the resources it had conquered, weakening its ability to feed its people, fuel its ships, and supply its forces. That complexity reached its most haunting point in August 1945, when the United States used atomic bombs against Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Supporters have argued that the bombings forced Japan's surrender and avoided an invasion that could have killed enormous numbers of Allied troops and Japanese civilians. Critics have argued that Japan was already weakened, that alternatives existed, or that the bombings introduced a terrifying new age of mass destruction. Historians still debate the decision, its necessity, and its meaning. What is beyond debate is that the American contribution to victory ended not only with triumph, but with the beginning of the nuclear age, a shadow that still stretches across the modern world. But before the final surrender, there were millions of smaller acts that held the Allied war effort together. American nurses followed armies across continents, treating bodies torn by shrapnel and infection. Merchant mariners crossed the Atlantic under threat of U-boats, carrying supplies without the same public recognition given to combat forces. Engineers built airfields on remote islands and bridges across shattered rivers. Seabees carved bases out of jumble and coral. Coast Guardsmen landed troops under fire. Intelligence officers broke codes. Scientists and technicians developed radar, proximity fuses, medical advances, and the atomic bomb. Farmers fed not only Americans, but Allied soldiers and civilians abroad. The war was won by armies, but armies were sustained by a civilization mobilized down to its smallest habits. Women transformed the American war effort. They built aircraft, welded ships, inspected ammunition, joined the military in auxiliary and support roles, worked as nurses, drove vehicles, decoded messages, and kept families functioning under strain. The image of Rosie the Riveter became famous, but behind the poster were real women who endured long hours, dangerous work, lower pay, and social pressure to return quietly home when the war ended. Their labor helped prove what the country often refused to admit, that American strength had never belonged to men alone. Black Americans fought a war within the war. More than 1 million served in a segregated military, often assigned to support roles despite their ability and willingness to fight. The Tuskegee Airmen challenged racist assumptions in the skies. The 761st Tank Battalion fought in Europe. Black truck drivers kept supply lines alive. Black sailors, stevedores, engineers, medics, and infantrymen served a country that denied them full rights. Their contribution to victory cannot be separated from the WWII campaign, victory against fascism abroad and victory against racism at home. World War II did not end segregation in America, but it accelerated the moral pressure that would help fuel the civil rights movement. Japanese Americans also served with extraordinary distinction while many of their families were imprisoned by their own government in internment camps. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team, composed largely of Japanese American soldiers, became one of the most decorated units for its size and length of service in U.S. military history. Imagine the emotional weight of that service, fighting for a country that had questioned your loyalty while your parents or siblings lived behind barbed wire. Their courage forces America to remember both its ideals and its failures. Native Americans served in every theater, including as code talkers whose languages became weapons of communication the enemy could not easily decipher. Latino Americans served in large numbers. Immigrants and children of immigrants fought for a country still defining what freedom meant. The American contribution was never one color, one region, one religion, or one background. It was a nation of contradictions, and in war, those contradictions marched together. America's greatest strategic contribution may have been its ability to fight two major wars at once. In Europe, it helped defeat Nazi Germany through ground combat, air war, naval escort, production, and logistics. In the Pacific, it carried the main burden against Japan after 1941, supported by Australians, New Zealanders, British, Chinese, Filipinos, Dutch, Indians, and others. Few nations in history have projected military power so far, so fast, and so continuously. The United States did not simply send armies overseas. It built the bridges of supply across the oceans. And yet, every bridge led back to a human being. A sailor on a destroyer escort scanning the Atlantic for periscopes, a marine on a Pacific island wiping volcanic grit from his eyes. A pilot writing a final letter before a mission over Germany. A mother in Ohio pausing at the kitchen sink when the radio announcer said there had been heavy casualties. A factory worker watching a bomber roll out of the plant and wondering whose son would fly it. A young medic hearing someone call for help in the dark. This is where the American contribution becomes more than tonnage and troop numbers. It becomes memory. When victory in Europe came in May 1945, crowds filled American streets, but the celebration was complicated by absence. Germany had surrendered, but Japan had not. Many soldiers in Europe wondered whether they would be sent to the Pacific. Families who had survived one fear now faced another. The war continued until August, when Japan agreed to surrender. On VJ Day, Americans danced in Times Square, kissed strangers, waved newspapers, and flooded streets with relief that must have felt almost physical. But even then, victory had a cost that silence could not hide. The men and women who came home did not all return whole. Some carried wounds the country could see. Others carried nightmares in private. Veterans returned to jobs, marriages, schools, farms, and neighborhoods, but part of them remained in foxholes, cockpits, engine rooms, jungles, and hospital wards. They built post-war America, raised families, used the GI Bill, bought homes, started businesses, and helped shape the world their sacrifice had made possible. But many rarely spoke of what they had seen. Their silence became part of the inheritance they left behind. The American contribution to Allied victory was therefore not one thing. It was not only Normandy, not only Pearl Harbor, not only Midway, not only the factories, not only Lend-Lease, not only the atomic bomb. It was the combination of all of it: production and sacrifice, adaptation and endurance, moral purpose and moral ambiguity, battlefield courage and industrial genius, national unity and national contradiction. America helped give the Allies what modern war demanded most: the ability to keep going when the enemy expected exhaustion. The Axis powers gambled that democracies were soft, divided, slow, and unwilling to pay the price of total war. They believed terror could break nations. They believed conquest could outrun production. They believed brutality could defeat coalitions. They were wrong. Democracies could be slow to awaken, but once awakened, they could become relentless. The United States proved that free societies, when threatened, could mobilize not only armies, but imagination, labor, science, and moral conviction. Still, victory should never become vanity. The American story is strongest when told honestly. The United States helped save the world from fascist domination, but it did so alongside allies whose sacrifices were immense. It fought for freedom while denying full freedom to many of its own citizens. It liberated camps and cities while making decisions that still trouble historians and citizens alike. That tension does not weaken the story. It makes it human. It reminds us that history is not marble. It is flesh and choice. Today, the factories are quiet or transformed. The shipyards no longer glow through the night in the same way. The young faces in wartime photographs have mostly vanished from living memory. According to recent figures, fewer than a tiny fraction of the 16.4 million Americans who served in World War II are still alive, making the preservation of their stories more urgent with every passing year. But the world they helped shape remains around us. The alliances. The military cemeteries. The veterans' photographs on mantels. The folded flags. The names carved into stone. The lessons debated in classrooms and war colleges. The warning that peace is not self-sustaining. The reminder that industrial strength without moral purpose can be dangerous, but moral purpose without strength may be helpless. When victory in Europe came in May 1945, crowds filled American streets, but the celebration was complicated by absence. Germany had surrendered, but Japan had not. Many soldiers in Europe wondered whether they would be sent to the Pacific. Families who had survived one fear now faced another. The war continued until August, when Japan agreed to surrender. On VJ Day, Americans danced in Times Square, kissed strangers, waved newspapers, and flooded streets with relief that must have felt almost physical. But even then, victory had a cost that silence could not hide. The men and women who came home did not all return whole. Some carried wounds the country could see. Others carried nightmares in private. Veterans returned to jobs, marriages, schools, farms, and neighborhoods, but part of them remained in foxholes, cockpits, engine rooms, jungles, and hospital wards. They built post-war America, raised families, used the GI Bill, bought homes, started businesses, and helped shape the world their sacrifice had made possible. But many rarely spoke of what they had seen. Their silence became part of the inheritance they left behind. The American contribution to Allied victory was therefore not one thing. It was not only Normandy, not only Pearl Harbor, not only Midway, not only the factories, not only Lend-Lease, not only the atomic bomb. It was the combination of all of it: production and sacrifice, adaptation and endurance, moral purpose and moral ambiguity, battlefield courage and industrial genius, national unity and national contradiction. America helped give the Allies what modern war demanded most: the ability to keep going when the enemy expected exhaustion. Omaha was not won in one grand heroic gesture. It was won by frightened men making one decision after another under impossible pressure: get up, move forward, help the man beside you, do not stop. D-Day did not win the war by itself. But it opened the Western Front that Stalin had demanded and Hitler feared. It forced Germany to fight a massive land war in the West while still bleeding in the East and defending skies and seas. American forces, alongside British, Canadian, Polish, French, and other Allied troops, pushed inland through hedgerows that turned Normandy into a green maze of ambush and artillery. Every field could hide a machine gun. Every road could be mined. Every village had to be approached as if death waited behind the stone walls. Liberation did not look like a parade at first. It looked like mud, smoke, and exhausted civilians stepping out from cellars unsure whether to cheer or weep. Then came the breakout. American mobility became decisive. Once Allied forces broke through German lines in Normandy, the war became a race across France. Here the American genius for logistics mattered as much as battlefield aggression. Tanks needed fuel. Trucks needed tires. Men needed ammunition and food. Medical units needed plasma, bandages, and evacuation routes. The famous Red Ball Express, driven heavily by black American soldiers serving in a segregated army, hauled supplies across France under brutal conditions. These men were often denied equal treatment by the country they served, yet they helped keep Allied armies moving. Their contribution deserves to be remembered not as a side note, but as part of the machinery of victory. Somewhere in France, rows of white crosses and stars of David face the sky. Somewhere in the Pacific, wrecks sleep beneath blue water. Somewhere in an American attic, a uniform hangs in a garment bag, smelling faintly of dust and time. Somewhere, a family still has letters tied with ribbon, the handwriting fading, the words still alive. They are fragments of a moment when the United States stepped into the largest war in human history and helped turn the balance toward victory. The American contribution to Allied victory was not perfect. It was not simple. It was not solitary, but it was enormous. It armed nations before it fought. It built faster than its enemies could destroy. It crossed oceans with armies. It helped crack Nazi Germany from the west while the Soviet Union crushed it from the east. It drove across the Pacific island by island until Japan's empire collapsed. It paid in treasure, labor, grief, and blood. And when the smoke finally lifted, the world was not free from danger. But it had been spared something worse. If history has taught us anything, it's that the greatest mysteries are often the ones we think we've already solved. So when we ask how the Allies won World War II, the answer is not found in one flag, one battle, or one leader. It is found in the uneasy, extraordinary power of nations choosing to endure together. What do you think truly made the difference? American industry, battlefield sacrifice, Allied cooperation, or something deeper? History beyond, where the past never stays buried.